We are just about on time right now. We're going to be running over just a few minutes. We will hear a few remarks from our two recipients. And if anyone in the audience has questions, we have passed cards around. So you may write your questions on the cards, and we will take a few minutes to hear answers to those questions. If you need a card, please raise your hand. We do have an extra card. Jerry Shestack, would you like to begin your remarks?
Well, I'd like Tom Burkett to begin.
All right.
I was hoping Jerry would. Well, let me say first of all that for me it is a great honor to be here together with Harold Coe. When he was Assistant Secretary for Human Rights, one had the sense and conviction that that there was somebody in the U.S. government who really believed in that job and in what could be done. And I remember meeting you in different parts of the world when you were performing that function. And it was, for me, to see you and hear you and see what you were doing filled me with great pride and gave me hope. So I'd like to pay homage to you for the work that you did as Assistant Secretary, and I wish it could have been much longer. Now, after you hear Harold, what is there to say? You've covered everything. I have the great advantage as a sitting judge. I can always say I really can't comment on any of the things and I would really like to do that after he covered about everything that could be said. There are a few things. I don't want to get into the internal American aspect of the problem. But for one thing, as an American judge sitting on an international court in a foreign country, you meet two conflicting things. On the one hand, there is tremendous goodwill towards the United States, and now tremendous expectation in what can be done and what the future will bring. So I'm hopeful that whoever is president, that the values that used to guide American foreign policy in the past will again have the impact that they had in the past. But the United States, in fact, was responsible for creating the international, in many ways, the international human rights system. We've neglected it in the past, in recent past. But I think it is possible to reestablish that. And I must say, I've been afraid to go back to Latin America, where I used to promote human rights and was received. I was afraid to go back now because I thought they would just laugh me or whistle me right off the stage. I think it won't take very long to reestablish that. There is in the world, and we sometimes forget that, there is a universal yearning for human rights in the world. You see that all over. We somehow don't have this feeling for what it means in many countries. They actually believe that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is an important instrument that gives them rights. We don't believe that. As lawyers, we look at it, we say it's a non-binding instrument. But human beings who need human rights believe that this instrument has given them rights and given them rights against their governments, and that governments have the obligation to comply with these rights. And as a result, what has happened in the world, and we've missed that, I think, is that in many parts of the world, you get the sense of people that when their government engages in large-scale violations of human rights, their people believe that the government is no longer a legitimate government, and governments begin to lose their legitimacy to govern because they violate human rights. And that is a development that has strengthened the struggle for human rights around the world. One final point. Harold mentioned the International Criminal Court. I think it is critical, the International Criminal Court. what is even more critical at this point is to strengthen its independence. There is pressure now being brought to prevent the indictment and trial of certain individuals. It's important for this tribunal, for this court, to have total independence, because it's wonderful finally for people around the world to be able to see heads of state sitting as criminals and being accused of violating human rights. It has a tremendous impact also on potential violators of human rights, to know that there is an international criminal court. Even the ad hoc tribunals are performing an important function in that sphere. As a matter of fact, I happen to believe that we need regional human rights criminal courts to try other things than what the International Criminal Court can try in all regions of the world. And we need more international regional human rights courts in Asia, sub-regional courts in Asia and in other parts of the world. We need to create many more institutions that actually apply international human rights law. The climate is there. People around the world are eager, and U.S. leadership in this field would be welcomed and could do tremendous things under people like Harold Cohen when he was Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights.
I was told that I had 2 minutes to make comments. Giving a lawyer 2 minutes, especially a trial lawyer, is really a very funny line. But when Tom said that Dean Cohen said it all, that was correct. Now I can say Tom and Dean Cohen. You know, Harvard has a motto which is Veritas. Yale's motto is Veritas lux. When I hear Dean Cohen, he always gives the light in addition to the Veritas. I think one of the points that Dean Cohen pointed out was that the United States has lost its moral authority. I never would have thought that the United States would be involved in torture at the highest levels, rendition, unwarrantless surveillance, attacks on the independent judiciary, violation of checks and balance, misuse of signing statements, all of these things which have deteriorated from our own moral authority. It's very hard to go out and champion human rights around the world when they can say, take the beam out from your eye before you talk about the one in my eye. And that's a difficulty that hopefully in a week or so we will overcome. I think there is another area that needs developing. Governments have sovereign power, and we were thought for a while that governments lost their sovereign power. To some extent, they would lose their sovereign power by being subject to a rule of law that would be worldwide or universal in its approach. As it turns out, governments are very reluctant to give up their sovereign power. On the other hand, we have large industry, big businesses, part of globalization, that also have a tremendous power. And I think it's important that we hold these corporations to standards of equity for their employees, to standards of non-discrimination, to standards where they abide by human rights in the countries that they are in. How we do that, I'm not sure. But I think that you now have another power, which is the global corporation, that must be dealt with to restrain and to make them do the right thing, just as human rights and law tries to do that from government. The other encouraging thing that I find is the development of law. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which Dean Coe mentioned 60 years ago, at the time that it started after the UN, it was a set of standards of achievements for the world. The first group of 11 are much like our own Bill of Rights. The next deal with things like right to education and right to health and right to welfare and right to social security. Those rights that make a person whole. You know, a slave who is hungry is still a slave who is hungry is a slave, but a slave who is not hungry is still a slave. And someone who is not hungry and someone who is hungry but is not a slave is really a slave. There has to be a well-being for the human being with respect to fighting poverty and those destructive elements of our environment that make a person whole and are really an element of human rights in today's world. Law is very important in achieving that. Law changes happens, brings about customs. Eventually, even law that's not followed has an influence. It gives dissenters a reed on which they can rely, on which they can talk about, on which they can use to stimulate their protests and their ambitions and their aspirations for human rights and for treating people the way they should be treated. So we're living in a world where there are pros and cons. You have some good that has arisen over the past years. Perhaps things are developing. The world is supposed to go in cycles, and perhaps the next cycle will be one where human rights and justice can prevail. I think it takes the efforts of a lot of people, NGOs, government, ordinary people. It's not just something that one can do in a solitary way. And again, when I'm all through, I'm left with hope.
We have some questions here. The promotion of human rights has expanded over the last few years to include a collective responsibility to protect populations from genocide, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. How optimistic are you about the implementation of this new concept? How can the U.S. advance this concept? Roberta Cohen.
Well, I see. Should I think the question in some ways relates also to the resolution that the UN adopted on this subject. That is the obligation to protect. I think in the future, this resolution, which is now nobody seems to know much about it, is going to become another universal declaration of human rights. And with the adoption of this resolution, whether the UN knows it or not, it has in fact legitimated the right of the international community and the obligation of states to act when states commit genocide and ethnic cleansing and other gross violations of human rights. So I think this resolution, which will take quite a while to be implemented, and it will take a long time, is one that is going to lay the foundation for a very much more active international community involvement in the prevention of large-scale violations of human rights.
I agree. The responsibility to protect seems to be something that's almost impossible with respect to a Security Council that has veto power and will prevent peacekeeping on a scale that it should be, or has prevented action in places like Darfur. Even the African community has prevented it. But it's a concept that needs developing, and sometimes these concepts get a life of their own after they're heard, and you see how they make common sense. What you're saying really is that you should anticipate situations of genocide and crimes against humanity and do something to prevent it in advance, not after 2 million people have been killed in Darfur to say, well, that's terrible and that's genocide and we ought to do something about it. It's too late at that point. So how you do that and still maintain the sovereignty of nations to which they're very devoted is a difficult concept. but it may come. And it's certainly worth trying to push. A lot of our concepts that we thought would never realize have become adopted, part of international law, part of customary law, and the right to protect ought to be one of them.
I would add only that the responsibility to protect will turn on whether the next administration acts on Darfur, and the conditions are there to act. But a critical point, the responsibility to protect must be exercised somewhere other than when white people are being the subject of genocide. Secondly, it also has to be accompanied by other steps. Accountability for past violations, cutting off blood oil, which is leading to future violations, protection of refugees. The interventionistic part of it is only one piece of the picture. Question 2, how important do you think the U.S. Supreme Court will be in reestablishing the U.S. leadership in human rights? Well, I guess that depends on who's on the Supreme Court, right?
No, of course it's important. We have a court now that I think is has at least 4 members that are sort of oblivious to it. Even the issue of foreign law, they ignore it, even though our founding fathers thought that the international law and founding law was something that we should consider, and you find that in the constitutional debates. It's too obvious a comment to say that we've got to change the court. How that will change, I don't know. We have only 4 members of the court. We have 4 members of the court. We're young, comparatively young. We have 2 members of the court. One who is quite old, Justice Stevens, is 88. Another member of the court is not well. A third member of what I'll say the liberal side of the court would like to leave if he could. So there are appointments that are going to come, but will it change the court? I don't know. There is one thing that perhaps gives you some hope. To some extent, courts do react to the people, to what people want and to what people believe in. There is a synergy between court decisions and what the popular will is. So I think our popular will should be understood to favor the poor, the discriminate, the abused, and those that really need the help of the Supreme Court. Perhaps that will bring around those who are on the court who don't have that view now. But the United States is rather unique in the respect and the attention it gives to the Supreme Court. I think that's been well deserved over the course of history. I think it's important for any country to show me a court that's not a country which doesn't have an independent judiciary, and I'll show you abuse of power and disregard of human rights and corruption. So it's very important, not only in our court, but everywhere else. So again, I hope the opportunity will be for the kind of justices to be on the court that I can be proud of all of them.
I would add only that this reminds you of the famous joke about how many psychiatrists does it take to screw the light bulb? You know, the light bulb has to want to change, right? The court has to want to influence human rights and see that as its mission. Why? Because when the Warren Court came in, there were a few other progressive courts. Now there are many. We see a group of people here from the South African Constitutional Court, the Canadian Supreme Court. The International Court of Justice has leading human rights figures on it. The European Court of Human Rights is developing an active jurisprudence. If the United States Supreme Court is a non-factor, human rights law will be made by other courts and other entities. And the United States has to want to influence that development, it would seem to me. And I think whether they like it or not, they will get the cases. So when the question of whether you could sue under the Alien Tort Claims Act finally comes to the U.S. Supreme Court. 6 justices did identify a basis for finding a cause of action because those cases had been litigated in lower courts for 24 years by the time he came.
Let me just add a point that's slightly off. It is very difficult to be the American judge on an international court which orders the United States to temporarily suspend the execution of a person and only to find that the state of Texas feels free to be able to execute that person, notwithstanding the judgment of the International Court of Justice. So when we speak of re-engagement with the international community, this is the type of problem we have to face, and to recognize that if we're going to be part of the international community, as far as human rights, democracy, and respect for the rule of law is concerned, we're going to have to comply with judgments of international courts and decisions of international tribunals. If we don't do that, and if we don't adjust our system to being able to do that, there is no hope.
A question, what is the proper response to those who point out there have been no terrorist incidents since 9/11 under the Bush administration? I think the proper response is Elvis has also not reappeared. I don't necessarily see the causation between those two events. I think the obvious response is to frame it that if you're not with us, you're with the terrorists. And if you're interested in an approach to terrorism that takes account of human rights, you're somehow with the terrorists, as opposed to with the rule of law, with the American spirit. It turns out I am not with the terrorists. I just didn't see the choices that the administration made as the only ones that might actually prevent terrorist attacks. I don't think that torture has made us safer. I don't think many of these other devices have made us safer. The torture, by the way, has made it impossible to prosecute a number of these individuals because the evidence will be thrown out. And so the idea that the tactics that were adopted were the only way to achieve a result and cause the results, it's highly debatable whether they caused the result, but it's also clearly not the case that they were the only tactics which could have led to that outcome.
Marcia Rose, you have a question? I've never been in a meeting where you didn't have a question.
Senate President.
I should have said, Giuseppe Visconti came up to me earlier today and he said, that we made a mistake in that award. And I said, with some trepidation, what was the mistake? She said, we should have given it to both you and Marcia Rose.
Well, I guess I'm the presiding judge up here. Isn't that amusing? Well, anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you for a tremendous session. Thank you, Dean Coe, Dean Lawrence, Dean Rebez, Judge Buergenthal, and Mr. Shestack. And ladies and gentlemen, thank all of you for joining us today to honor these two outstanding individuals. Please join me in a final salute to our... reception across the hall in the Kelly Lounge. Thank you. Oh, I know.
Thank you very much.
Yes, yes.
Oh, yes.